I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker. Ashley Brundage is a leadership and empowerment expert who started her second career as a means of survival. Fighting discrimination, harassment, and homelessness, Ashley found employment as a part-time associate and then rose to National Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion in less than 5 years, working for a major financial services organization. She captured this process of career development in her new award-winning book and online course called Empowering Differences. Personally, she enjoys time with her 2 teenage boys who serve as the main source of inspiration and empowerment for her. She also volunteers for numerous organizations, most notably as the vice chair for the GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, National Board of Directors, which works to accelerate acceptance for the LGBTQ plus community. Ashley, we are so happy to have you here today, and I cannot wait to jumpstart this conversation. Before we get into some of the questions we want to talk about, is there anything else you think our audience should know about you today?
That major financial services organization, that was PNC Bank. And I started there as a part-time bank teller and then worked my way up. And I was there when the dust settled amongst the global pandemic that started this entire remote hybrid work combination. So I'm excited to share a lot of what I learned.
Excellent. Awesome. All right. So we're here to have you talk about DEI best practices for virtual engagement. To get us started on this subject, could you tell us about how virtual engagements are different from an in-person event when it comes to DEI?
Yes. Oh my goodness. So in relation to how we used to do things, who can get in the room. But when it comes to virtual events, the first thing you have to think about is, does someone have internet access? Does someone have a laptop? Does someone have resources? I live in an area where they offer 500 megabytes per second. And this is like a whole new way of thinking. But is that what I actually get every day? So there's just a lot more to think about. And the old way of thinking was, let's build it and they'll come. Well, you just have to build it differently. And for DEI, it's all about representation and driving impacts and driving results. And in order to do that, you have to really think and plan strategically and then drive your change through the actions you're going to take.
I think that's a really good point to make. Like you said, the in-person events just have slightly different considerations than virtual events. I know Power to Fly, when we were still doing in-person events, and hopefully we will be able to get back on the road soon. But when we were still doing in-person events, a lot of consideration after we started them was given to things like, is the location within within reach of public transportation? How reachable is the location if you don't have a car? And that was something that we hadn't really considered when we first started hosting events, but then we started to think about more and more when we realized, the groups of people we're trying to reach out to and who are historically marginalized are the people that maybe, physically located further from these opportunities. So yeah, I think you're right. That's a very good thing to highlight. When it comes to these considerations, is internet, obviously internet connection would be top of mind, but are there any other, kind of big considerations that come to mind when you're talking about a virtual event like this?
Oh my goodness. Well, I often refer to this as the P word, and it's not a bad word, but people are so afraid sometimes to say the word privilege. And while privilege is one way on the yin and yang way at which we move through the world, there's a counterpoint or a counterbalance point to everything that moves in this world. So for privilege, there's disprivilege. And I think if people really understand how those two things flow at the same time, and for every single privilege, there's a potential disprivilege that can exist, and that when you wake up in the morning, instead of like, we did microphone checks before we did this virtual event, and we did a video check, you should be doing a privilege check. Just the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning and be thinking about, okay, can I see? Can I hear? Do I have this ability? Did I Did I get that email? Did my alarm go off? Right? All of these things should be part of what you do to operate in this world, to have a better understanding of what someone might be going through on the opposite end of the spectrum. And that's ultimately why empowerment is so important when you're thinking strategically in relation to an event or an opportunity that's going to exist to connect people together. This is the ultimate goal as to why you do that. And empowerment and privilege are so important when you're planning these types of events to bring people together, because that's your goal, right? Is to drive change and impacts for people. So if you don't think about it strategically, then you're going to put yourself in a position where maybe someone might be left behind.
Yeah, that's a very, very good call out. And I think that it's very important that we highlight things like that. Privilege, you're right, is a very uncomfortable word for a lot of people. In my experience, it's a very uncomfortable word for a lot of white people. And when you start thinking about it, at least for me, to get people over that disconnect or that, that negative association with that language, we talk about it in terms of resources. How resourced are you? Because people, I feel like, have a much better understanding of the fact that you could be really resourced in one area and not in another. Maybe you're really resourced when it comes to, housing, family support, all of that kind of thing. But maybe you're really under resourced when it comes to your health or to your mental state, and the support that you have there. So well, I love that idea. Yeah. Of taking stock.
Well, and one more thing, when you're taking stock of those resources, remember where you are in the world largely drives so many of those other factors. And for those of our listeners or watchers or or text readers, however you're accessing the platform today, think about where you sit in the world, because if you're sitting in the United States of America, which I know probably many of you are, and you're participating, number one, we have East Coast time privilege that exists. So where you sit in the world has a large impact. As someone who works sometime in the year, parts of the year in Asia, I'll have to tell you, like, people schedule that to 1 p.m. meeting, and I'm like, oh, okay, you do know that that's like at 1 a.m. for me. So just, you have to really be cognizant, especially as you're planning an event or partnership, that you create that opportunity to think about not only what people go through and the privileges they have, but where they sit in the world, how they sit. Everything has to be kind of in this planning process. And I know it might sound overwhelming, but you're not in this alone.
Well, we're not in this alone, and we're doing it for the benefit of other people, right? Like, it's right. Kind of, in my mind, it's a little bit of kind of basic manners, which my parents always taught me, is like, manners is how you show respect for other people. And so, if you were having someone come to your party and they're in a wheelchair and there's no ramp access to your house, you'd figure something out because they're coming to your event. And roughly it's kind of the same. Have those considerations. Think about what, the various ways that most people might show up to your event. Where are they coming from? And I love that focus on like something like where you sit in the world, which for the vast majority of us was not something we picked ourselves, is absolutely huge. So let's talk about the ways that these best practices kind of differ when we talk about asynchronous and synchronous events. You're talking about being in Asia for part of the year. So you might be participating in events hours or days after they actually happen for the people that were there, when the event occurred. So let's talk about kind of the different concerns with an asynchronous versus a synchronous event.
Yeah, well, I think the number one thing is you want to be able to offer your event or your programming in as many platforms, and to make it more accessible, you have to be able to have it reproduced in essence. So what I really want you to think about is, and also the other thing on the flip side, yin for every yang. So the other thing to think about is that your platform and the way you're moving, right? People are starting to get a little bit overwhelmed or burdened upon asynchronous style events and learning opportunities. So you have to have a way to interconnect with the other humans that you're, coming on this journey with, especially as it relates to anything in the diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, or as I commonly call it, the leadership space. Okay. As you're moving in that space, you have to be really cognizant that they want something they can tangibly hold. Like I have my notepad here. They want something they can physically see or hear. They want to be able to touch something. They want to be able to interact with the speaker and ask a question in that moment. So those are all real things to think about in relation to this. And so asynchronously, you want to be able to have someone digest and access the information on their own time, but you definitely have to incorporate those small elements like a text line or a chat line or the speaker portal, conversational link, or direct social media handles, those kinds of things. So that way that person can feel comfortable to reach out. I just think it's just so important. We can't get stagnant in this model of, driving, oh, we have to just do the event, so we're just going to produce it, record it, and put it out to the world. Well, it can't just be that, because if it is, that's just that, people will watch one, but they're not going to continue to engage on your platform, and you're not going to have the impact metrics driven growing.
Yeah. So, okay. So when we're talking about this impact, because what you're saying has given me huge flashes of, like, I host chats for Power to Fly every week, and we record them and we save them and we put them in our chat library so people can access them later. But now I'm thinking back, and you're right, like there's not a ton of interactivity that can be done, or at least that we're setting up the opportunities for, when it comes to, kind of the rewatch, or people that come to, get to the recording without ever being aware of the, the live nature that they could have attended. When we're talking about these interactive activities that you want to provide for people, how can we ensure that we are enabling equal participation for all attendees? Now, obviously, this sounds like kind of a perfection thing that you're continuously trying to reach for, but where should we start? What should people know and consider first when it comes to trying to set up that equal opportunity participatory factor?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love about the Power to Fly platform is the networking opportunities that are specifically called out during your events and summits. So I think that to have that live on, one of the things that I did so I built an asynchronous learning platform, which is my Empowering Differences online community and course. And one of the call outs that I was specific on doing was to create this online community. And so that way it lives on. And it's accessible to anyone who has a LinkedIn profile. So they go in and they can actually join my community. And then we bring our content to you. And then you can engage on that platform and ask your questions as you're moving through the asynchronous information. But then also we're sharing the live event from today is there, right? So there's constant engagement, and it will always live on. Because I think that's how you keep people on your platform and really engaged.
All right. So if we're talking, and one thing I just want to highlight before I forget, y'all, and I'll keep driving this during the conversation, but if y'all are interested in a participatory angle like Ashley and I are talking about, definitely put any questions or comments you might have into that group chat. It's there on the right hand side of your screen in front of you. But we definitely want to hear from you. If you've got questions or you want to dig in deeper on something that Ashley's talking about, please let us know. So that way we can give you the interactive experience that we hope y'all will take advantage of. All right. So I feel like when you're talking about an in-person event, a lot of effort and a lot of communication that we send, it regards how we're trying to create this safe space, right? And we want to lead from the front of saying, like, hey, even if you don't feel like maybe you're a part of our community or the target audience for this event, everyone is welcome to participate. We want to encourage that. If we are doing it in a virtual setting, it can feel a little bit more nebulous or harder to outline. So when we're talking about these safe spaces and trying to create them virtually, what should we know? What should be the first step when you're trying to establish this, as a safe space for your event?
I think you should test. You should test it, and you should see what it would be like and how you're going to feel the engagement, or what the inclusion, right? What's your goal, and how are you going to feel it, not being present in the room. We do rehearsals, we do planning meetings, especially when you're hosting an event in person. And in the future, right, as we move through this, there will always be some sort of virtual component to what you're doing, whether you do it or your attendees do it. Because guess what? They're all bringing some sort of electronic recording device every time we move amongst this world as humans. So they're going to be streaming you, they're going to be recording you, they're going to be taking pictures of what you're doing at your event. So whether you do it or not, someone's going to be doing it. So you want to be thinking about it from that construct as well. And as you move through this event or any kind of partnership that you're doing, also think about to be looking for the metrics that you can drive from the event, because the metrics is really, that's where empowerment lives. Empowerment will always combine three key elements, and I often call it that app that you don't even have to download. It is not one that lives on a computer. It's an app that drives impacts for DEI, which is authority, power, and people. And so authority, power, and people will be the recipe of how you move through any event. And if you know what each thing is, people, obviously, you can figure out who the people are. But the authority is the feeling or the connections of who's in charge and how people learn to be in charge. Because that's why we do DEI programming. It's about driving leadership impacts. So the authority has to be driven at your event. So you need to know how you're providing authority for people. Okay, and you're going in this planning session. So the authority will typically be some sort of leadership development principle that's being driven from the speaker that you selected, or the venue that you chose, or the topic that you chose. All of those things are driven in that realm. And then power, let's not kid ourselves. A lot of people will see power as money, but it's much more than money. It could also be time, it could be treasure, it could be talent. But usually power is a tracked resource or metric driven from your engagement of what you're doing. So power will always also have a number attached to it, and the number is the power. So when I started my advocacy work and I was just one out transgender advocate working in this world, I was one. But then when I decided to start doing rallies and I went to City Hall and I brought 300 people with me, the 300 now was the power. One could be the power, but 300 could be more power. So as you're planning this engagement or an event or to grow your DEI program, be cognizant to think about what your authority and what the power that's being driven from the engagement that you're planning. Because if you don't know what the impact is and then what the number impact is, that's where this world will live for you. I'm sorry, I got on a tangent.
No. I love that. And I love your mnemonic of app. I think that's great. We did have a couple questions in the chat. People wanted to know if you could kind of expand on the differences between that power and authority, because I think it's making sense to me, but I also understand how it could be kind of it's especially in the terms. I feel like we use these kinds of things interchangeably. So for your app system, how do they differ?
Yes. So remember that authority is more emotion driven. But it also is where someone will tell you that you're in charge, right? And so it stems around development is really the core principle around authority. So if you're planning this event that you're working towards and highlighting the future of work, right? You need to be thinking about how you're developing people, because people development is what I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the conversation. DEI programming 100 years ago, what we called it? We called it leadership programming. And we weren't as polarizing to people around their differences. So as you're navigating in this world now, think about, is there a way that we can start moving it back to being leadership programming? So that way, all people then feel that it's accessible to them and that they want to learn about the differences. And then the flip side is the power is more of a resourced item. It's a tracked metric that's going to always usually have some sort of number involved. And that is, right, how many people joined your event, right? And that's one of the best things about having a virtual or hybrid event is the ability to track how many people have clicked the button. You can track how many minutes they were online, right? You can track if they were paying attention and if they had other windows open. All of those things are part of the power that you can track from an event.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, we are getting some more questions in the chat, so please feel free to submit those if you have them. Leah had said they were curious about logistical and setup, like those introductory best practices when it comes to DEI. Now, I feel like a lot of us consider things like closed captioning or subtitles, offering up what your pronouns are to make people more comfortable if they would like to share theirs. Land acknowledgements, I feel like, are one that has honestly been around for a while, but a lot of people, it kind of comes and goes out of fashion, apparently. Like I'm coming to you from Northwest Ohio. That is traditionally and historically the land of the Seneca tribes, Iroquois, and Kickapoo. But I don't know a ton of other people that do, that kind of check those things or make a point to announce them every time they have a DEI event. So if that's not something that we're doing, or if maybe we're not sure where we might have holes in there, what should we be thinking of when we're going to set up these events? Is there maybe a checklist that we should go through?
Yeah, well, I think that you, ultimately you should have someone driving the ship for DEI. That would be really paramount. And hopefully that person is a paid person who does this work professionally as a DEI practitioner. That would be number one.
Yes.
But
huge call out there.
Yeah. And if not, then hopefully you're reaching out to the millions of DEI consultants that are out there who are going to be experts in this space and practitioners. But I would say you want to be mindful, and you're right. I'm coming to you from the land of the Seminoles, and the Seminoles actually still have a reservation just a couple miles from where I live. So obviously being cognizant of where you are, back to where you are in the world, those things make major impacts. But having that kind of DEI checklist around I think accessibility obviously is one of the biggest things that you need to think about if you're planning an event. You mentioned it, captioning, it sends the message, even for people who might not mandatorily need captioning. In a lot of ways, it can benefit the person who's watching online, and it can make it easier for them to understand what people are saying sometimes in the communication. But you also want to watch captioning because if it's not an actual professional captioner, it can catch things wrong from sometimes. And I've seen some real interesting ones on that too. So there's not, I'm assuming that you could probably Google, right, a best practice list, but you really have to put in the work is my point here around this.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's really important. You can Google a list and that's great. But if you're going down the checklist and not really considering what each of those situations, would entail, it
or the why.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And you're right. Like closed captions thing. I have ADHD. It's not something for me, but I do know a ton of other people with this disorder find it much more easy to concentrate on, on a video or something like that if they have closed captions. And so that it's one of those things that when you're talking about, even something as ubiquitous as closed captioning, people tend to think about that in terms of hearing impaired people, but that's not necessarily the only group that might benefit from that. So I love that kind of, that acknowledgement of the intersectional uses for some of these accommodations. Is it enough to just say, hey, if you need accommodations, reach out to us? Or is that kind of like we talked about earlier, putting the work back on the under-resourced community?
I think it's at a bare minimum. It's you're making somewhat of an attempt, which is better than doing nothing. And I don't think you want to do nothing or you wouldn't be here today. So I just would be mindful of that. This whole world that we move in is ever changing, and technology changes every single minute. All of our majority of our differences change every moment. My ability, right, your eyesight gets worse typically. Shockingly, last year mine actually got better. I don't know what happened.
Eating lots of carrots, maybe. That's what my mom always told me.
I went from working 2 jobs to 1, so I think that has something to do with it.
Just maybe, just maybe.
Yeah, stress level reduction actually helps to, your body and mind and soul connect. So your age, so we're older than we were just 10, 20 minutes ago. So things change so much. I think that we have to get out of this mindset of differences being so static and thus only focusing on ethnicity or race, because that's typically where people go in the DEI realm. But if you are moving in this mission and you're planning an event, be thinking about navigating all of the common differences that we hold as humans, because they're important to everyone. And it's your opportunity to take that uber focus on ethnicity and race right now, because we're still living in that moment somewhat, and amplify all the other differences: age, ability, class, social, economic class, status, gender, sexuality, all of so how religion, how people move in this world is largely connected to our differences. I researched differences for 8 years before I became a leadership and empowerment expert. It was all about understanding and navigating and learning about differences and how each one requires a different recipe of empowerment. So as you move to figure out what the recipe is for you independently, you're also needing to plan out what the impact is going to be driven for your organization. And you do that by tracking metrics and driving authority, right? So the power, authority, and people, all that is back to where we are again.
Okay, cool. We did have some other questions in the chat. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them. We will be forwarding those on to Ashley. So if you have questions, it's okay. Please feel free to submit them. Ashley, in the last minute we have, what can our audience, what should they know about you going forward? Should they be following some of the stuff that you're doing? Are there, guidelines that you would like to lead them to? What would you like to leave our audience with?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Just to keep thinking about empowerment in the way that I'm presenting it to you, because it will really connect with other people. It's about giving up that authority and power to people. And yes, definitely engage with me at Ashley T Brundage and at Empowering Diff. You'll engage with all kinds of amazing content, and I would love to learn more about what you're up to. So I'm always reachable, because we have to make ourselves accessible to provide empowerment for other people.
Excellent. Ashley, I just want to say a huge thank you for spending your time with us this morning, bringing your expertise to share with our community. It has been wonderful to get to chat with you.
Thanks.